In this video, I am going to discuss about overheads allocation, apportionment, reapportionment and reciprocal servicing. Under absorption costing, or this is also known as full costing, production overheads should be identified per unit. Overheads are the indirect costs which will be incurred in the production. There are two types of overheads which are production overheads and non-production overheads. Now we already know this. When it comes to calculating the production cost per unit, we only consider the production overheads. We do not consider the non-production overheads. For examples, production overheads, electricity cost, maintenance cost, supervisor's salary, rent, machinery. This cost is very important. Supervisor's salary. Most of the students think supervisor's salary is an direct cost, but actually this is an indirect cost because supervisors do not involve in the production directly. Only the laborers or the employees on the working floor will directly involve in the production. What supervisors do is they supervise the employees. So supervisor's salary is not a direct cost. This is an overhead. For non-production overheads, selling and distribution costs, administration costs, advertising and marketing costs. These are some few examples. Direct costs can be easily identified for a cost object or for a cost unit, but overheads cannot be easily identified for cost object or for a cost unit. We know this already. That is why we called these costs as overheads or indirect costs. Allocation, apportionment, reapportionment and reciprocal servicing methods will be used to identify production overhead cost per unit. So in this video, we are going to discuss about allocation, apportionment, reapportionment and reciprocal servicing. These methods will help to identify the production overhead per unit. The final goal is to calculate an accurate production overhead cost per unit. This is also known as the OAR. OAR is overhead absorption rate. This is the final goal when it comes to overhead allocation, apportionment, reapportionment and reciprocal servicing. We need to calculate the OAR. These are the steps to follow to calculate the OAR. First one is overheads allocation, then apportionment, then reapportionment, then lastly we can calculate the OAR. Before we continue this topic, we need to understand what is a cost center. We discussed about this earlier. A cost center is a department, function, or area of the organization that incurs costs. As we discussed earlier, there are four cost centers. Function. This includes production, marketing, research and developments. These are few examples. There are more functions within an organization. Activity. Assembling a product, conducting market research, managing inventory. Service. Accounting, information technology, human resources. Location. Rent, utilities and other expenses related to maintaining a physical presence in the location. The term cost center will be frequently used under overheads topic. So now let's discuss about the first step to calculate the OAR, overheads allocation. Directly identifiable overheads will be allocated to relevant cost centers. This term is very important. We are going to allocate the directly identifiable overheads to the cost centers, not to the cost units, because we cannot directly identify the overheads to the cost units. But some overheads can be directly identified for cost centers. These are overheads which do not incur for the whole organization or for the whole business, such as supervisor's salary for the production. These overheads are known as specific overheads. This term is important. Cost centers are categorized into two types under overheads allocation. The first type is production cost centers. This means these cost centers are directly related to the production. And the other type of cost centers are service cost centers. These are cost centers supporting the production. So now let's do an example so you can understand what we have learned so far. Company A manufactures mobile phones. There are four cost centers identified in this company, which are assembling, testing and quality control, IT, administration. Following are the production overheads incurred for a year. So they have directly given us the cost centers in this business, which are assembling, testing and control, IT, administration. First of all, what we have to do is we have to identify what are the production cost centers and what are the service cost centers. So assembly, is this a production cost center or a service cost center? This is a production cost center because this is directly involved in the production. Then testing and quality control. Is this a production cost center or a service cost center? This is a production cost center because testing and quality control is directly related to the production. And then they have given the IT. Is this a production or a service cost center? This is a service cost center because IT is not directly involved in the production, which supports the production. Then they have given the administration. Let's say admin. Is this a production or service cost center? This is also a service cost center because administration is not directly involved with the production. They are supporting the production. This is how we categorize the cost centers under the topic of overheads. And now let's identify these costs. Supervisor's salary for assembling is $30,000. This means this 30,000 is under assembling cost center. Then they have given the supervisor's salary for testing and quality control. So this is under testing and quality control, 25,000. And then they have given the IT costs, which is 12,000. So this is under IT, 12,000. And the administration costs are 8,000. So this is equal to 8,000. And they have given rent, electricity and maintenance costs. Can we categorize these costs under the given cost centers? Just think about it. Rent, electricity, maintenance. We cannot directly identify these costs under each cost center because all of the cost centers are incurring some portion of these costs, means the rent cost, electricity and maintenance. These are known as the general costs, or these are known as the general overheads, because we cannot directly identify these costs under any cost center. These costs are general to the whole organization. So the first four costs are specific overheads, because we can identify these costs directly to cost centers. So how can we allocate these costs to cost centers? Which is done by apportionment. Apportionment. Earlier we discussed about the allocation. Here, allocation means we can directly identify the overheads and we can directly allocate these costs to cost centers. But now these general overheads cannot be directly identified for each cost center. Now what we have to do is we have to distribute these general overheads among the cost centers, which is known as the apportionment. General overheads cannot be allocated to cost centers directly. Now we know this. These costs incur for the whole organization or for the whole business, such as rent, electricity costs, most commonly utilities bills. These are general overheads. These general overheads will be apportioned to the cost centers using a fair base factor. This is important. Using a fair base factor. Simply, apportionment means the general production overheads will be distributed among cost centers using a fair base factor. Meaning we are going to distribute these kinds of general overhead costs among the cost centers using a base factor. Now let's do this example. This is the same example as before. So now we know these are directly identifiable costs, which mean specific overheads. These are non-specific overheads, which is known as general overheads. So we can simply allocate these costs into cost centers. There is no issue here. Now what we have to do is we have to apportion these general costs among the cost centers, which is known as the apportionment. So how can we do this? In order to apportion the general costs, we have to have a base factor. So they have given two base factors. The floor space for each cost center respectively are 500 square meters, 200 square meters, 175 square meters and 125 square meters. And they are telling us to use this base factor for rent and electricity. Meaning we can use this base factor to apportion the rent and electricity costs among the cost centers. This is how we can do this. In order to do that, we have to calculate the percentage for each cost center using this base value. So what we have to do is we have to calculate the total base value, which is equal to 500 plus 200 plus 175 plus 125, which is equal to 1000 square meters. So using this value, we have to calculate the percentage value for each cost center. Now let me calculate the percentage for assembly. So the total value is 1000 and the floor space for assembly is 500. They have given here. This is the floor space for assembly multiplied by 100. This is the percentage for assembly, which is equal to 50%. Like that, we can calculate the percentage values for other cost centers as well. So for testing, 1000 and the floor space for testing is 200 multiplied by 100, which is equal to 20%. This is how we calculate the percentage values. So using these percentage values, we can apportion the rent and electricity cost. So how we can do this? So the total rent is 200,000. Simply this means out of this 200,000, 50% will incur for the assembly. So 200,000 multiplied by 50% is equal to 100,000. This is how we apportion the general overheads using a base factor. Base factor here is floor space. So for the testing and quality control, 200,000, 200K multiplied by 20%, which is equal to 40,000. Likewise, now we can apportion the rent and electricity cost using this base factor or the percentage value. This is how we apportion the general overheads among the cost centers. In the exam, they will clearly indicate what is the base value to use. So using this base value, you have to calculate the percentage value. And using the percentage value, you have to calculate the apportioned general overhead for each cost center. Now let's calculate the apportioned electricity for each cost center. So the total electricity cost is 100,000 multiplied by 50%, which is equal to 50,000. So now we're done with the rent and the electricity cost. In order to calculate the apportioned maintenance cost, they have given another base factor, which is this. Machine values for each cost center respectively are 10,000, 8,000, 1,000, 2,500. Use this as the base factor for maintenance cost. So these are essentially the cost of machinery of each cost center. Using this base factor, we have to calculate the apportioned machine cost. So again, we have to calculate a percentage value. So the total is 10,000, 8,000, 1,000, 2,500. This is equal to 21,500. So using this value, now we have to calculate the percentage values. So for assembly, 21,500, this is 10,000 because the machine value for assembly is 10,000 multiplied by 100%. We are calculating the percentage value here. This is equal to 46.5%. Now using these percentage values, we have to apportion the machinery maintenance costs among the cost centers. Now let's do this. So for assembling, 40,000 multiplied by 46.5%. This is how we use the reapportionment method. I hope it is clear now. Now that we know the specific overhead cost per cost center and the apportioned general overhead per cost center. Now let's calculate the total production overhead cost for each cost center. So the supervisor's salary for assembling is 30,000, which comes here 30,000. Testing 25, IT 12, administration 8. So these are the allocated costs. These can be easily identified and allocated to cost centers. Now let's assign the apportion costs we just calculated earlier. Now we can calculate the total production overhead cost for each cost center. So these are the total production overhead costs for each cost center. Remember that these two cost centers are service cost centers and these two cost centers are production cost centers. Now let's discuss about the third step, which is the reapportionment. We discussed about allocation, then apportionment. Now the third step is reapportionment. What is reapportionment? The final goal is to calculate the production overhead cost per unit. If you can remember, this is the final goal of these steps. In order to do that, we need to reapportion the production overhead costs proportionately into production cost centers from the service cost centers. As I said earlier, these are the service cost centers and these are the production cost centers. Under reapportion, what we are going to do is we are going to reapportion these overheads into production cost centers because we need to calculate the production cost per unit. In order to do that, we have to move the service cost centers costs into production cost centers. This is the reapportionment. We are going to apportion overheads again. This is why it is called reapportionment. Service cost centers do not provide services to themselves. This means to their own cost center within the business. They provide services to the other cost centers within the business. This is really important. All the cost centers are providing services to each other. They are not providing services to themselves, especially when it comes to service cost centers. They do not provide services to themselves. They provide services to the other cost centers within the organization or the business. This is how we can represent the point above, which means service cost centers do not provide services to themselves. Look at this row. This is the IT cost center, which is a service cost center. IT service cost center provides 30% of their services to the assembly cost center and provides 40% of their services to the testing and quality control. And they do not provide services to themselves. And 30% of the services will be provided to the administration. And we have another service cost center, which is administration. So they provide 20% of their services to assembly and 30% of their services to testing and quality control and 50% of their services to IT, and they do not provide services to themselves. Very important thing to notice here. Service cost centers will provide services to other cost centers including other service cost centers. IT is a service cost center which provides services to another service cost center. And this administration cost center will also provide services to all the other cost centers within the organization. But they do not provide services to themselves, which are these instances. Service cost centers do not provide services to themselves, which means to their own cost center within the business. They provide services to the other cost centers within the business, including other service cost centers. Total percentage of providing services to cost centers should equal to 100%, which means this is the IT service cost center. Now let's calculate and see if this is equal to 100%. 30%, 40%, 70% plus 30% is 100%. So this is correct. Now for the administration, 20% plus 30% is 50. 50 plus 50 is 100%. This is also correct. In the exam, they will provide different types of service cost centers and different types of percentages. So you have to have a clear understanding about these tables and how to extract data from this table for the calculations. There are two methods to reapportion service cost centers production overheads into production cost centers. The first one is repeated distribution method. The second one is equation method. Now let's discuss about the repeated distribution method first. Under repeated distribution method, until the service cost centers overhead values become zero, repeatedly distribute the service cost centers production overheads among other cost centers. Note that only the service cost centers overheads will be reapportioned. This means production cost centers overhead values will increase and the service cost center overhead values will decrease as the repeated distribution happens. Let's do an example so you can understand what is repeated distribution method. First of all, we have to identify the total production overhead costs for each cost center. We calculated these costs earlier, which is this. These are the total production overhead costs. Now let's fill the table. So now let's discuss about how to do the repeated distribution method. If you can remember, these percentage values were given previously, which are these values. As you can see, 30%, 40% and 30% again for IT. 30%, 40% and 30% again. For admin, 20, 30, 50. 20, 30, 50. So using these values, we are going to repeatedly distribute the service cost centers production overheads to the production cost centers. This is how we are going to do this. You can select any service cost center first. In this example, I select the IT service cost center. So here is the IT service cost center. What we are going to do is we are going to distribute this amount with other cost centers using the percentage values given. So the total production overhead cost under IT service cost center is 66,380. we are going to distribute 30% of this value to the assembling line, which is equal to $19,914. Then we are going to distribute 40% of the IT service cost center's cost to the testing. So 66,380 multiplied by 40%. This is equal to $26,552. What we are essentially doing is we are distributing this $66,380 among the other cost centers. So we use this parenthesis to indicate a negative value because we are distributing this value among other cost centers. For administration, so what will happen here is this value is 0 because we just distributed this value among the other cost centers, and the administration is equal to 50,140 plus 19,914. This is equal to $70,054. So now what we are going to do is we are going to distribute this value among the other cost centers like we did earlier. But now we are going to use the percentage values for administration service cost center, which are 20, 30, 50%. These are the values for administration service cost center after distributed among the other cost centers. This is equal to 0. As now you can see, there is again a value under IT, which is $35,027. Now what we have to do is we have to again distribute this value among other cost centers, including the administration service cost center. Now you can identify the pattern. So after we distribute this amount, the value for IT will be 0 and there will be a value for administration again. We are repeatedly distributing the service cost centers overheads until these values become 0. So as we continue this process, both of these values will become 0, IT and administration costs. So until that, we have to repeat this process. Always remember the percentage values are not changing. For the IT, the percentage values are the same. This is how we can continue the repeated distribution method. As you can see, this method is very lengthy. You don't have to worry about this because in the exam you are not required to do these types of lengthy calculations. But you have to have a clear understanding about how the repeated distribution method works. So at the end, what we have to do is we have to calculate the total production overhead cost for each cost center. As now we know, for the service cost centers, the total production overhead cost will be 0, and the total production overhead cost for production cost centers have been increased. So now using these values, we can calculate the production overhead cost per unit. As now you can see, this method is bit lengthier. But you don't have to worry about this because there is a shorter method, which is the equation method. In this method, overheads of each service cost centers are expressed as an equation. This is the summation of total production overhead of the service cost center and the reapportionment amount of the other service cost center to the subjected service cost center. This equation will be formulated for every service cost center. Now let's see how we can use this method. First of all, we have to formulate equations for every service cost center. Now let's formulate the equations for service cost centers. In order to do that, we need total production overhead cost for every cost center and the percentages of service cost centers services to the other cost centers. Now let's the IT service cost center as letter I and administration cost service cost center as letter A. Now let's formulate the equations. Simply we are going to calculate the total production overhead cost for the service cost centers after the reapportionment. So for IT service cost center, it has already a allocated amount which is 66,380. This amount plus the reapportionment amount from the other service cost centers. As you can see, administration service cost center provides 50% of their services to the IT service cost center. So 50% from the administration service cost center. Let's simplify this equation. I is equal to 66,380 plus 0.5. 50% is equal to 0.5 times A. This is the first equation. Now let's formulate the second equation for the second service cost center. So the total production overhead cost after the reapportionment of the service cost center's overheads is equal to the allocated amount, which is 50,140 plus this is the allocated amount for the administration. From this table, we can see IT provides 30% of their services to administration. So 30% from the IT service cost center. Now let's simplify this equation. This is the second equation. Now we can solve these two simultaneous equations in order to find the values for I and A. So what I am going to do is I am going to multiply the second equation by 0.5. This is the third equation. Now what I am going to do is I am going to add the first equation and the third equation. As now you can see this 0.5 times A and this 0.5 times A will cancel each other out. Now we can easily find the value for I. I is equal to 107,588.23. This is the total production overhead cost for the IT service cost center after the reapportionment. Using this I value, now let's find the value for A. So what I am going to do is I am going to assign this I value to the first equation. As now you can see, we can easily find the value for letter A. So A is equal to 82,416.46. This is the total production overhead cost for administration service cost center after the reapportionment. If there are more service cost centers, we have to repeat the same process in order to find the total production overhead cost for each service cost center after the reapportionment. Now what we have to do is we have to find the total production overhead cost for the production cost centers after the reapportionment. In order to do that, we need to formulate equations for production cost centers, which is same as this. So for the assembly production cost center, the total production overhead cost after the reapportionment is equal to the allocated amount, which is 198,600, which is this amount plus the reapportionment amounts from the service cost centers. So 30% from the IT plus 20% from the administration. Now we can directly find the value for this equation because we already found the values for I and A. Now let's assign these values. So the total production overhead cost for the production cost center assembling is equal to 247,359.76. This is the total amount after the reapportionment. Now let's calculate for the testing and quality control. This is equal to the allocated amount 99,880, which is this amount, plus the reapportionment amount from the service cost centers. This is equal to 167,640.23. This is the final amount. This is a dollar value. This is also a dollar value. Now let's check these values from the repeated distribution method. As now you can see, we got the same answers. So in conclusion, the equation method is quick and easy than the repeated distribution method. This is how we can find the values after the reapportionment. I hope it is clear now. Now let's discuss about the final step, overheads absorption rate. This is denotes by OAR. This is the rate at which the production overheads are absorbed to per unit of production. So OAR is equal to production overhead divided by the activity level. So these are the values we just calculated. Here are these values. Activity level can be number of production units, labor hours or machine hours, which means this denominator can be either number of production units, labor hours or machine hours. A fair activity level should be selected to calculate the OAR, which will reflect an accurate consumption of overheads by that activity level. If the question is not directly indicating what is the activity level is, you have to select a fair activity level in order to calculate the OAR. Now let's do this example. The company manufactures 100,000 units in a year. To manufacture a mobile phone, it takes 2 hours of labor in the assembly line and 1.5 machine hours in the testing and quality control line. Calculate fair OARs for assembling and testing and quality control production overheads. So this is the same example as before. So for the assembling production overhead is equal to, it is this value. Testing and quality control production overhead is equal to, it is this value. So this is the formula to calculate the OAR, production overhead divided by the activity level. Usually in the exam, they will directly indicate you that what is the activity level to use in order to calculate the OAR. If they do not indicate that, you have to select a fair activity level in order to calculate the OAR. So in this example, they have given the number of units, the machine hours and the labor hours. These are the main three types of activity levels we can use to calculate the OAR. So let's think about the assembly production overhead cost. What will be the fair activity level we can use to calculate the OAR? In this question, they are telling us it will take 2 hours of labor to manufacture a mobile phone in the assembly line. We can use this activity level to calculate the OAR for assembly production overhead. So, OAR for assembly production overhead is equal to, the production overhead is 247,359.76 divided by the activity level. Activity level should be the total activity level. So it will take 2 hours to manufacture a single mobile phone and they are producing 100,000 units in a year. So this multiplied by 100,000. So this is equal to 1.236. Let's round it off to 1.24. So this is a per labor hour value. because we used hours in the denominator. So this will be $1.24 per labor hour. Now let's calculate the OAR for testing and quality control divided by the activity level. So what activity level we should use here? They are telling us 1.5 machine hours are taken to testing and quality control. Let's use this value because this seems like the fair activity level. So 1.5 machine hours and they are going to produce 100,000 units. This is equal to 1.117. Let's round it off to 1.12. So the OAR for testing and quality control is equal to $1.12 per machine hour. So these are the OAR values. Using these values, now we can calculate the total production cost per unit. But there is another important thing to notice here. In order to calculate the total production cost per unit, we need to convert these OARs to per unit values. The OAR values are correct. These values are correct. But if the question is asking you to calculate the total production cost per unit, you have to convert these values to per unit values. It is really simple. This is how we convert the $1.24 per labor hour into per unit value. So this is the value for one labor hour. So how many labor hours will it take to manufacture a mobile phone? They are saying 2 labor hours will be taken. So we can simply multiply this value by 2. So 2.48 per unit. This is how we can calculate the per unit value. Now let's convert this value to per unit value. So this is 1.12 per machine hour. How many machine hours will it take to test and quality control a single mobile phone? They are saying it will take 1.5 hours. So we can simply multiply this value by 1.5 because this is the value for one machine hour. It will take 1.5 machine hours to test and quality control a single mobile phone. In other words, per unit. So this is equal to 1.68 per unit. This is the per unit value. I hope it is clear now. Now let's discuss about the predetermined budgeted OAR. Usually cost per unit is determined at the beginning of the year because the price of the product should be calculated before start selling. You can understand this. Management accountants need to know what is the cost of a product before they sell it in order to set the prices. Usually at the beginning of the year, they calculate the cost per unit using the budgeted values because actual values are not available at the beginning of the year. But at the end of the year, actual values will be available. For this reason, a predetermined budgeted OAR is calculated at the beginning of the year. This is an estimate figure or a budgeted figure. After the year end, this estimated figure should compare with the actual costs and adjust for the actual profit to calculate. This is known as over and under absorption. We will discuss about in greater detail under absorption costing. This is the formula we can use to calculate the predetermined OAR or the budgeted OAR. It is the same formula as before, but here we use the budgeted production overheads and budgeted activity level. Earlier we used the actual production overheads and actual activity level. But under predetermined OAR, we use the budgeted values. Now let's do this example. If the company A estimates to incur $200,000 production overheads in the next financial year and the budgeted production units are 50,000, calculate the budgeted OAR. So budgeted OAR is equal to budgeted production overheads divided by the budgeted activity level. The budgeted production overhead is 200,000 divided by budgeted activity level 50,000. This is equal to $4 per unit. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.